Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server. Link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce a communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this. At the end, have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notation. Today's reading will be the 1950 Appeal for the Movement's International Reorganization. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you would prefer to read it on text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for sake of understanding the context. And there's a lot of context to go through for this one. This is the first one that I had very direct issues with the text itself of this. I had issues previously of the general themes and whatnot of previous stuff, but this one in particular, oh boy. Anyway, in addition, in the reading, I supply my own commentary, of which there's much here, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. So, for this analysis, in the text, the foremost class enemies of the international proletariat are identified as the most developed and imperialist nations, which can only be overthrown by violent proletarian revolution. Therefore, it calls for the maintaining of the correct stance in the burgeoning conflict between the USSR and the West. Aside from some pure historical revisionism about World War II, which it should have been aware of and was backed by a 1993 introduction, on some frightfully unintelligent perspectives about tactics in the post-war period, it reminds the international communist movement to organize strictly on a class basis and denounce any group influenced by policies from a bourgeois state. It calls for a rejection of basing party tactics on the ethics of class society and thereby any calls for peace between classes. The proletariat and the party must always keep their focus on the goal, no matter the conditions they are in, and organize in the aims of achieving that without being waylaid by any claims various bourgeois states put forward about moral superiority. At all times, the party must reject calls that lessen class conflict, or to ignore the necessarily inhumane character of capitalism, no matter how a given state seeks class collaboration between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. To that end, the party should focus only on the working class, and not seek mass support via specifically classes or interclass demands. Class struggle must always develop, and the international objectives of the proletarian organization must be in tune with this development. I should not take sides in inter-imperialist conflicts that follow revolutionary defeatism in this period of imperialist capitalism, and need to follow. Any party center which does not follow the correct tactics of revolutionary defeatism, centering of the working class, rejection of class collaborationism, rejection of bourgeois moralism, or takes any associated action which does not increase class consciousness ideologically, organizationally, and materially in terms of its selection of timing and forms that party action takes, should be rejected by the rank and file and opposed viciously as enemies to the proletariat. And that is the lessons that I took of this once it had been extracted from some of the ooh, I won't go into detail here. Difficult parts of this text. Let's just say that. I will now begin the full audiobook reading. I hope you enjoyed the session and will attend the next one as well. Welcome back to another reading session of the United Marxist Pact's Investigations into Worker Organizations. As to say, the association which can bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're looking into the construction, the organizational structure, the principles and tactics as usual. And we've been away for a week. I had some stuff in real life to deal with, and as much as I enjoy these things, I couldn't put this aside, and I had to put this aside for the time being. But we are going to be continuing. Now, we added in a bunch of additional readings, but we're going to continue for the time being going through. We will probably go back at some point. This text is the 1949 Appeal to the Movement's International Reorganization by the International Communist Party. This is a left communist position, and it is split up into a 1993 introduction, the alarming crisis in the proletarian movement, first symptoms of reaction to Stalinism, 1. Reaffirmation of the weapons of the proletarian revolution, violence, dictatorship, and terror. 2. Complete rupture with the tradition of war alliances, partisan fronts, and national liberations. 3. Historical denial of defensism, pacifism, and federalism between states. 4. Condemnation of shared social programs and political fronts with non-working classes. 5. Proclamation of the capitalist character of Russian social structure. And finally, the conclusion. So, with the 1993 introduction, the following text, written in 1950 with a view to being published in French, is still as relevant today as it was then. On the one hand, this is because the evolution of the capitalist world, Russia included, has more than confirmed our expectations. On the other, because the reactions of many groups of vanguard workers against Stalinism have never ceased to be hybrid and confused. A reaction which has taken the form of democratism, or even a negation both of the role played by violence in the class struggle, and the Revolutionary Party as fundamental and indispensable organ of the proletarian dictatorship. Thus, it became a serious and urgent task for the Marxist left to draw a demarcation line between itself and the myriad array of other political groups and currents which grew on the rotten soil constituted by democratic or para-democratic criticisms of the Soviet regime. So, in other words, people were saying, oh, Stalin's position failed and the Communist Party failed because it wasn't democratic enough, which is kind of what Trotsky was arguing with his text on the new course, which you read earlier, in which he talked about the development of bureaucracy and how democracy is necessary to defeat bureaucracy. I've not actually seen a solution directly out of the left communist tradition, but I assume that they would say that the organic centralism would deal with that problem. And to some extent it would. It just slows things down in other ways. Anyway, the Democratic critics of the Russian regime would in fact find their most avid supporters amongst the big bourgeoisie of the capitalist West, with the latter hoping to open up the vast Russian market, quite happy to urge them on and encourage them in their criticism of quote-unquote Russian totalitarianism. Eventually, as the doors at Shrine of American Capital, the hamburger bar, swished open in Moscow to a fanfare of international publicity, McDonald's, the crusaders of democracy would see their dream of an elected parliament realized. But it would not be long before the staggering hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie would be revealed once again, and a chorus of Western quote-unquote world leaders would support President Yeltsin as he dissolved parliament, banned several papers, and drowned the opposition of the parliamentary Democrats in blood. He shelled parliament and killed 2,000 people in order to secure his position. It is an episode which serves as renewed testimony to the fact that the capitalist regime alternates the totalitarian and democratic means of government to defend its class rule. All right, so that's the 1993 introduction done. Now we're back to 1950. The alarming crisis in the proletarian movement. The organization of the working classes of all countries in the world is, as a result of a series of splits and the spread of defeatism, almost totally dominated by two forces. On the one hand, there is a traditional form of democratic socialism, based on peaceful relations between classes. These organizations support a program of social and political collaboration with the bourgeoisie and plan to defend the workers' interests by legal means within the framework of the bourgeois constitution. They suggest that private enterprise will gradually change to socialism, on principle reject the use of violence and the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the other hand, there are those parties which defend the government in power in the USSR. These herald the USSR as a worker state with a policy modeled on revolutionary communism as defined by Marx and Lenin. And consistent with the great victory of the October Revolution, this second force in the proletarian movement claims, in theory, not to reject the tactics of insurrection, dictatorship, and terrorism. At the same time, however, it says that it is expedient to use in capitalist countries the same tactical methods as the property owning and non proletarian classes, and even their propaganda slogans and demands as well. For instance, there's a call for national welfare, for the safety of the fatherland, and the slogan of peaceful coexistence between classes with opposed interests within the framework of parliamentary democracy. The application of such politics, identical to social democracy, is dependent on the satisfaction of certain conditions. There would have to be peace between the government of the Soviet Union and the bourgeois governments. The workers of the world would have to admit that, by safeguarding the Russian power as a premise and a promise of world socialism, they are guaranteeing themselves against future capitalist exploitation. And both the workers and the capitalists would have to acknowledge that, for an unlimited period of time, the Soviet Union could coexist with the capitalist power in normal and peaceful manner. I don't understand, why would it have to be an unlimited period of time? Simply calling for peace right after a giant war and your enemies have nuclear weapons does not mean that you're saying peace forever. Of course not. I mean, any great power situation is supposedly automatically of the understanding that any peace is simply a prelude to war. This is any realpolitik position. And if we are taking a realpolitik position in the sense that, uh, you know, we're assuming that these are bourgeois states and the bourgeois states are engaging in this realpolitik relation, and I would argue that the USSR absolutely was engaging in realpolitik, which is problematic in of itself, right? Very problematic, in fact. Um, but there's no basis to make a claim that simply calling for peace between nations um, indicates calls for eternal, unlimited peace, right? There's tons and tons of brinkmanship. Anyway, these conditions of fool's paradise are summed up by the bourgeois Democrats in hackneyed formula of quote unquote non-intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign states, and a new, even more ridiculous slogan of quote peaceful competition between socialism and capitalism. From time to time, the rank and file of the working class has rebelled against the obvious contradictions of this historical viewpoint, and though until now these rebellions have been limited and uncertain, they will undoubtedly gain in strength. The incessant propaganda is increasingly less successful in hiding these contradictions. It is skillfully aimed at deliberately confusing long-term objectives with immediate ones, the tactical expedients with principled positions, and is selected according to a particular social setting. The plan of convincing the capitalist countries that they can very well let the Soviet regime survive without making a military attack or engineering a social upheaval can only mean convincing them that it is not a working class state and therefore no longer anti capitalist. Such a policy emphasizes the true state of affairs. Convincing the workers in the bourgeois countries that they need not organize their forces for an insurrection and the overthrow of their national economic, administrative, and political systems may very well help to recruit members from the social strata who normally support the Social Democrats. It has no effect, however, on the more advanced workers. To them is offered the perspective of a generalized war between states, leading to the conquest of class power by the proletariat, a role which Marx and Lenin entrusted to the Civil War. When a war of this type is broken out, and irrespective of the side which started it, the Stalinists promised the groups of advanced workers a chance to try out illegal and defeatist actions within their own countries. In support of this vain promise, they say that these quote unquote partisans will be able to rely not only on their own forces, but also the parallel action of a perfected modern military machine. And yes, that is actually the case. That's exactly how it went down, like in Vietnam, for example, right? So, if they're saying this is wrong, then they're wrong. uh, so, I mean, there were circumstances, right? Greece, for instance, and gosh, Greece is probably a bad example because we are aware of the various shit that was pulled um, by like Operation Gladio, for example, within Western Europe. The better example would be India, wherein the Soviet Union not only allowed the blatantly social democratic bourgeois state of India into the effective common term, whatever it was called, and allowed them to call themselves communists or socialist in their constitution. But in addition, he went in and told the workers not to revolt against their own state, which is ridiculous. The Indian workers were ready, they were there, they were for it, they were prepared to take action, and Stalin said, "Don't do it." Which was, I mean, I can't tell you the future, but I can certainly say that it's ridiculous that he said not to. That goes flies in the face of everything. Um, However, it's incorrect to say that at no point when they could get away with it, they did not go in and help out, like in Vietnam, the uh, the DPRK, etc., etc. Continuing. The other section of their followers, which certainly make up the vast majority, are made up of workers having no revolutionary consciousness. Artisans, small landowners, shopkeepers, and middle class manufacturers, white collar workers and civil servants, intellectuals, and professional politicians. To this section, the Stalinists are continuing making proposals which go so far as offering a permanent united front, not only with the property classes, but also with the bourgeois parties, which they themselves classify as reactionary and right wing. They almost they also promise them a future of peace, both internal and worldwide, of democratic tolerance towards any political party, organization, or creed, of economic progress without conflict or expropriation of the wealthy, of equal welfare for all social strata. It is now increasingly difficult for them to justify, in the eyes of the masses, even the existence in the Soviet Union and her satellite states of a harsh totalitarian police state, controlled by Stalinists through a rigid one-party system. This degeneration of the proletarian movement has gone further than that of the revisionist and chauvinistic opportunism of the Second International and will last longer. The beginnings of this modern opportunism can fix, at the latest in 1928, the opportunism of the Second International reached the culmination of its cycle in the years 1912 to 22, though its origins went back much further than 1912, and its consequences went well beyond 1922. First symptoms of reaction to Stalinism. Recently, there have been signs of impatience with Stalinist opportunism. Both individual militants and groups have appeared on the political scenes of different countries, advocating the return to the doctrine of Marx and Lenin and the theses of the Third International at the first four Congresses. These latter denounce the Stalinists for their complete betrayal of the original policy. However, most of these splits cannot be regarded as a useful regrouping on a genuine class basis, even of a small vanguard of the proletariat. Many of these groups, as a result of their lack of theoretical work and because of their class origin, showed in the very nature of their criticism of Stalinist activity, both past and present, that they are more or less directly influenced by political schemes which originate from the imperial centers of the West and by the hysterical and hypocritical propaganda of liberalism and humanitarianism. But whether or not such policies are a result of the machinations of secret agents, the real damage they cause is to divert unwary militants. However, historically speaking, fundamental responsibility for allowing either means of counter-revolutionary defeatism to succeed rests entirely with the Stalinist opportunists. It is they who have given their stamp of approval to an abundance of bourgeois ideologies and theories, who frantically work to prevent the working class movements from being autonomous, independent, and ready to defend themselves, despite the fact that these attributes are so often stressed by Marx and Lenin. This confused and unfavorable course of the proletarian struggle coincides with the irresistible growth of highly concentrated industrialization, which is taking place as much in the old industrial centers as by the extension of industry to the entire world. It therefore aids the offensive waged by the United States against the masses of the world. The United States is the greatest pillar of imperialism and, as with all large concentrations of metropolitan capital, forces of production and power it tends to forcibly exploit and oppress the world masses by breaking down all social and territorial obstacles. The Stalinists have shifted the struggle from international objectives and have confined themselves to the defense of precise national objectives delimited by the political and military aims of the Russian center. As a result, they will be less and less able to lead either the international or national struggle, become more and more linked in with Western imperialism, as has been openly shown by the War Alliance. So, real quick. Are they talking about the War Alliance against the Nazis? This is what I fucking hate about leftcom shit when it comes to this sort of stuff. Okay. Okay. Oh man. The I'm just reminded of for a second of the that famous text that totally wasn't written by Bordiga. Um Auschwitz, the Great Alibi, where it's like, the genocide was actually about liquidating a section of the petite bourgeoisie and having some extra reserve armies of labor and stuff. It's like, okay, that might be a part of it, but I'm pretty sure the entire period of intense dehumanization and whatnot, along with the interests in essentially, targeting somebody who is already for centuries, millennia even, targeted by anti Semitism, you know, was the obvious thing for the Nazis to do. Like, I don't think that you need to design some sort of conspiracy in this direction when really it's like, yeah. And the Illuminati, they're not talking about the non-aggression pact. They're talking about the war alliance between the Soviet Union and and America, Britain, France, etc. They became part of the Allies. Ah, anyway, the Marxist position has always been that the foremost class enemies are the great powers of the super-industrialized and super-colonial countries, which can only be overthrown by proletarian revolution. In accordance with the Marxist viewpoint, the communists of the Italian left today address an appeal to the revolutionary workers' groups of all countries. They invite them to retrace a long and difficult route and to regroup themselves on an international and strictly class basis, denouncing and rejecting any group which is influenced even partly or indirectly by policies and Philistine conformism emanating from the state-controlled forces throughout the world. The reorganization of an international vanguard can only take place as there is absolute homogeneity of views and orientations. No, but okay. The International Communist Party proposes to comrades of all countries to follow the following basic principles and postulates. I disagree with this conception that everybody needs to agree on everything in order to have something go through, but whatever. It'd be nice, but it's not necessary. So the foremost class needs are the most developed in the imperialist nations. These can only be overthrown by proletarian revolution. The international communist movement must organize on strict class basis and denounce any group influenced by policies from any bourgeois state. There's nothing actually new about that, but okay. So 1. This is a basic principle and postulate. 1. Reaffirmation of the weapons of the proletarian revolution. Violence, dictatorship, terror. For revolutionary left-wing Marxists, knowing the acts of repression, cruelty, or violence towards individuals or groups have taken place, even if these acts are authorized or controllable, is not in itself a decisive element in the condemnation of Stalinism or any other regime. Manifestations of repressions, even the most severe repression, form an inseparable part of all societies based on class divisions. From its very inception, Marxism has rejected all the so-called quote-unquote values of a civilization based on class struggle, just as it rejects those rules of quote-unquote fair play, by which opposing classes are supposed to regulate robbery and murder to their mutual satisfaction. No extortion or offense suffered by quote-unquote human beings, no quote-unquote genocide, whether legal or illegal, can be fought by ascribing them to particular individuals or to who gave them their orders, but only by oh my god. This is more the same shit in that previous reading where it's like, there's no point in punishing the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials. Yes, there fucking is. Even if the system is what's producing these guys, it doesn't mean that we can't go in and say, fuck it, we ball. Fuck it, we're dealing with you. You as an individual who committed crimes, right? I, I think that genocide is going to be a crime in a class of society too, obviously, right? So I think that it would be valid to say that we would support condemning these individuals that are only following orders. Frick, it even used that word, didn't it? Yeah, whether legal or illegal, right? Why do they do this? What is the point? Right? I don't understand. But only by struggling for the revolutionary destruction of all class divisions. In the present phase of capitalism, which is characterized by mounting atrocities, cruelty, and supermilitarism, only the most idiotic of revolutionary movements would circumscribe its methods of action within the limits of formal kindness. Okay, sure. We're gonna add this. All right. So Marxism rejects the morals and ethics of class society, rejects calls which lessen class conflict. Parties need to analyze and bring attention to the necessarily inhumane character of capitalism, regardless of the face capital presents at any time. So, for example, social democracy, right? No matter how peaceful capital presents itself, the party should not soften its revolutionary position or abandon tactics necessary for the insurrection. For example, violence, the goal of establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the necessary abandonment of bourgeois morals, which, center private property. We reject their morals that place property over people. Continuing. 2. Complete rupture with tradition of war alliances, partisan fronts, and national liberations. Stalinism was first irrevocably condemned precisely because it abandoned these fundamental principles of communism by hurling proletarians into a fuck this. I okay, I'm just gonna read. Hurling proletarians into a fratricidal war, which divide them into two imperialist camps, thus strongly reinforcing the shameful propaganda issued by the camp to which it had become allied. This camp no better than the other would mask its imperialist greed, which was exposed decades ago by Marxist-Leninist criticism by alleging its respect for quote unquote civilized methods of war distinguished it from its adversary. It pretended that even if it was obliged to bomb, quote unquote, nuke, invade, and finally, after anxious soul searching, resort to hangings, it was not in order to defend its own interests, but to remove the threat to the quote unquote moral values of civilization and human liberty. Leninism has been the riposte when in 1914 the same disgraceful swindle saw the traitors of the Second International because the First World War was was exactly the same as World War II. Absolutely. There's no difference whatsoever. And it absolutely wasn't a war of aggression against the Bolsheviks, a war very, very, very directly aggressing. No, 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 no. This was a war between two imperialist powers. And you know, as 27 million sons and daughters of the Soviet Union died to defend themselves, you know, they should have done revolutionary defeatism because that would fucking work against the Nazis who were on their land. I don't know what they want. I don't fucking know what they want. Saw the Second International proclaimed a patriotic alliance against the imaginary ogre of Teutonic or Tsarist Congo barbarism. Exactly the same swindle would be the basis for Western imperialists entering the war against the new Nazi or fascist barbarism. And the same betrayal was contained in the alliance concluded between the Save Russia and the imperial states. For the Nazis themselves to begin with, and in the alliance forged between the workers' parties and bourgeois parties with a view to winning the war. These lies and betrayals are a matter of historical record, especially now when we find the Russians accusing the Americans of being aggressors or fascists, and the latter accusing the Russians of the same thing, while submitting that they had been able to use the atomic bomb, not ready in 1941, to massacre Europe, they would have done so, rather than using the armies composed of Russian workers mobilized for the same task. Okay. So, okay, what is it? Now suddenly utilizing an atomic bomb. You know, this directly, you know, in many ways goes in the face of the first part. I'm just going to say that. These are very contradictory things right here. But whatever. Anyway, it is true Marxism has always investigated and continues to investigate what lies behind the perennial conflicts between bourgeois states, groups, and factions, and from this investigation has drawn its deductions and historical foresight. But to oppose a civilized wing of capitalism to a barbaric wing of the same system is a negation of Marxism. Oh, God. Indeed, from a determinist point of view, it may well be that the proletariat gains more from a victory of the attacking party, which uses the harshest methods of combat, than otherwise. Thank you for that, Zolf. For human communities to pass beyond barbarism, the development of productive techniques is indispensable. But man has had to pay for this passage by subjecting himself to countless infamies of class civilization, to suffering arising from the exploitation of slavery, serfdom, and industrialization. It is therefore a fundamental condition for rebuilding of the international revolutionary movements that the traditions of chauvinistic politics shown in the support of the 1914 to 18 and 1939 to 45 war alliances, popular fronts, guerrilla resistances, and national liberations be equally condemned. Right. We don't actually, you know, defend slavery, right? We don't say, you know, slavery was a good thing, you know? It's historically progressive, and actually the worst forms of slavery, they led people to not liking slavery more, so it led the slaves to do revolts more, right? So we should be supporting, if by, refusal to support the people fighting against the worst forms of it, we should be, in favor of the worst forms of it. Wonder, I wonder if what they would say about, for example, women's liberations movement, right? Like the right to suffrage. I guess, instead of, getting behind the women's suffrage movements, instead we should say, you know, you're better off just not doing this and getting women more and more angry so that they cause more and more of a ruckus rather than getting your immediate win, right? I don't know what they're wanting from people. What are they wanting from people? What's the plan here? What is the aim to tell people that they should want bad shit to happen to them so people get more angry, right? What's the aim for doing that? Fighting the Nazis is a betrayal to Marxism. What the fuck is going through their head? Who would get up and stand in front of people and say that? Only people who do that, realistically, are fucking Nazis. I don't know what else to call it. This is completely inappropriate. I don't know why they put this shit in front. Okay, moving on. just moving on. 3. Historical denial of the I'm not even going to write any of this stuff down. This is fucking worthless. Nobody cares. And the people who do care are going to be liberals who use it as proof that communism and fascism are on the same side, right? That's what they're going to say. Anybody with any sort of actual, whose head isn't completely in the fucking clouds, is going to look at that and just be disgusted. Anyway, 3. Historical denial of defensivism, pacifism, and federalism between states. The guiding line of the Marxist position when facing the prospect of further war can be found in Lenin's writings. According to him, wars of the greatest powers since the time of the Paris Commune have been imperialist wars. This is because 1871 marked the end of the historical period in which there were wars and insurrections setting out the national boundaries of capitalist countries. Therefore, when war occurs, any class alliance, any suspension of class of position and pressure with war aims in mind constitutes a betrayal of the proletarian cause. For Lenin also, the revolt of the colored masses in the colonies against the imperialist and nationalist movements in underdeveloped countries in the modern phase of capitalism have a revolutionary significance only if the class struggle of the industrialized sector is neither halted nor loosens its connection with the international objectives of the proletarian organization. Whatever may be the foreign policy of a state, the real internal enemy of the working class of each country is its government. Except when the foreign nation is aiming for genocide, like not to take control of your country, but to wipe out the entirety of the Slavic race. Like that was on the list of goals of the Nazis. Very, very straight out. I've disliked other stuff that we've been reading Lemonades. There's a previous one setting out the foundation for this argument that's being put down, but here it has hopefully completed its formation of argument. Continuing. In this conception, considerably reinforced by experiences of World War XI, II, which confirmed the explicit forecasts made in the theses and resolutions of the Third International up to the time of Lenin's death, The period of imperialist wars will only draw to a close with the downfall of capitalism. The Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat must therefore deny any possibility of a peaceful settlement of the imperialist conflict. It must energetically combat any proposals that hold out the illusion that a federation, league, or association of states might be able to prevent conflicts by repressing, quote unquote, those who started them with an international armed force. Marx and Lenin, although aware of the rich complexity of the historical relationship between wars and revolutions, nevertheless condemned as an idealist and bourgeois deception the fallacious distinction between aggression and defense in wars between states. Now, I think that there's lots of examples of aggressors and defenders, especially between imperialist and colonized states, as just one example. I think that there are, in fact, fucking examples of that. And I don't think that it's like a fallacious distinction. I don't think that it's a questionable one. I think it's actually a very, very direct and obvious one. Like Israel and Palestine. Things don't get much more obvious than that. Similarly, the revolutionary proletariat should know that all superstatal international institutions are designed as a repressive force in order to conserve capitalism. Their armed forces are but a class police and a counter-revolutionary guard. Real international communism is therefore characterized by a total rejection of any ambiguous propaganda based on the defense of pacifism and a stupid formula of condemning and punishing the aggressor. No. No. Again, we can do both. We can do both. We can both attack, the system, and we can attack the pieces of shit that are the most violent and aggressive of the lot, right? This isn't like an either or thing, and it's not difficult. You can do both. How you do it is one thing, but that you can is very clear and obvious. Okay. We're going to we're going to get this, and we're going to put this in here. I'm just imagining, just for a second here. I'm unpausing while I'm taking notes. I'm just imagining the communist. So your people are at the end of an aggressor's war against you, and your people are being slaughtered, not like your soldiers, your citizens, because you're being invaded, and your invaders have a policy of Lebensraum, right? Genocide against you. They're trying to manifest a destiny across your land and kill everybody, because that's a goal, right? Their goal is to wipe you out as a race. And your Communist Party, who the proletariat is supposed to look up to, says, your enemy isn't, these guys who are coming in with the express intent to kill you. Your enemy is your own government. And, revolutionary defeatism, we should take care of our government and then fight against them. And it's like, well, hey guys, and now worse, we're talking about the Soviet Union. And they're like, no, we've already got a worker state. We've already done the revolution. You're saying that we have to do it again? I don't understand what they are asking the Soviet people to do in this situation. I don't get it. I want somebody to explain to me exactly what the plan was, what these people wanted the Russian proletariat to do in concrete terms. They need to explain it to me, because the only other thing is either this is a complete windbag of somebody whose head is so far up his ass and in the clouds that he has no idea what's going on, or he's an apologist for Nazis. Those are the only two situations. Either he is so completely ignorant of the destruction of the war and the danger that was associated with it, or he's on the side of Nazis. Those are the only situations, right? Like, if we're talking on consequentialist grounds, because that's what he was saying, on a consequentialist ground, maybe we should support the Nazis, right? In that sense. Then that's the only, because they're the more barbarous of the lot. Because that's the only result that you can come to a conclusion of. It is the only result. Either he's fucking stupid, or he is the most big piece of shit I have ever read. Okay, repause. All right, so one, Communist Party should not take sides in inter-imperialist conflict. Reminder, I'm taking what is actually useful from this. I'm going to fucking ignore all the bullshit when I'm taking my notes. 2, the proletariat needs to follow revolutionary defeatism. 3, the class struggle must always develop, and international objectives of the proletarian organization must be in tune with it. Okay. Part 4, condemnation of shared social programs and political fronts with non-working classes. It is a tradition amongst the left-wing opposition of many groups, dating back to the first tactical errors of the Third International, to reject as incorrect the methods of agitation, rather badly defined as, quote, Bolshevik. Especially after the complete and irrevocable elimination of all feudal institutions, working towards a final armed confrontation between the proletariat and the ruling classes for formation of a worker state and a worldwide red dictatorship. One involving political terror and expropriation of all privileged classes, cannot be achieved if, at certain times and in certain places, we omit to mention these aims. Yes, they can, but I understand what you're going for, but it absolutely can. Anyway, this is just an out of place ultimatum, which are precisely the program of communism and of communism alone. It is an illusion to think that one can conquer the masses more quickly by putting orders for popular agitation in place of class positions. Equally, it is a vain illusion to confidently suppose that the leaders of such a maneuver are not themselves taken in by it, although it is so often proclaimed, at best it is nonsense. Every time that the main content, always said to be transitory, of a political maneuver has been a united front with opportunist parties, or there has been a demand for democracy, peace, or non-class popularism, or worse still, national and patriotic solidarity, it has never been a matter of suddenly hoisting up the scenery. After having weakened the enemy front with this crafty camouflage, to reveal an army of soldiers of the revolution ready at the crucial moment to open fire on the temporary allies of yesterday. Quite the opposite has occurred. The masses, along with the militants and leaders, have been rendered incapable of class action. No, no. The Bolsheviks did a united front. They allied with their national bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie, and the peasants. And they were able to continue their class action. Yeah, they allied with the socialist revolutionaries. Yeah, both the lefts and the rights, for that matter. Indeed, even in places where it didn't work out because he didn't get the support they expected from the USSR, like in Greece and in France, right? They absolutely had class action and they had a united front. It just didn't work because other conditions came in and fucked it up. The people had the will, but the objective conditions were not there. So how it's handled was a bad way. And yeah, I do think that you're not actually getting recorded here, Kilroy, unfortunately. Uh, Indeed. I'll figure out how to make sure whether or not people can be heard other than myself here, because I've historically just been reading out what other people have been saying, and usually they type it. Anyway, let's see. These historical conclusions are no longer founded on doctrinal criticism alone. They derive from the terrible historical experience so dearly paid for of 30 years of bankrupt efforts. Okay. And also plenty of other examples. I don't see your revolution having succeeded, Mr. No United Front. So can we say terrible historical experience with your end of things too? Yeah, China, it's up there. This is 1950. This is right after the Communist Revolution succeeded. So, yeah, the, yeah. Therefore, a revolutionary party will never again attempt to gain mass support with demands specific to the non proletarian and socially hybrid classes and likely to be made by them. This particular basic criteria does not apply to the intermediate and specific demands which arise from the concrete antagonisms of interest between wage earners and employers in the economic sphere. It is, however, in opposition to classless or interclass demands, especially political ones, whether they be made by one nation or internationally. This criteria, flowing from criticism of the proletarian political United Front, the slogan Workers' Government, and a popular and democratic front, establishes a boundary between the movement supported by us and the one calling itself the Fourth International of the Trotskyists. Our movement is separated in the same way from all those other kindred versions, which under a different title revive the slogan of revisionist degeneration. Quote, the object is nothing, the movement is everything. How did they get to that conclusion about Trotskyism? Anyway, and which accordingly end up cherishing superficial agitations lacking in all content. Like what? Like what? Why is this on this reading list? I've not particularly hated a lot of this stuff. The previous thing, the party program, the it it had the elements for this, but this has just gone so completely off the rails. Anyway, 5. Proclamation of the capitalist character of Russian social structure. The way in which the economy, legislation, and administration of the Soviet Union has developed over the last 30 years gives historical proof that the workers' revolution can be submerged not only in a bloody civil war, as was the case in Paris in 1871, but also by progressive degeneration. This is equally illustrated by the ruthless repression and extermination of the revolutionary Bolshevik nucleus, which paid dearly for having allowed the party to be transformed from an iron vanguard into a top heavy, amorphous mass, incapable of exercising control over its own legislature or executive. The monetary and mercantile character of the greater part of the Russian economy, which in no way contradicts the presence of state control of vital services and industries, found also in several big capitalist countries, presents us not with a worker state menaced by degeneration, or the process of degenerating, but by a state which is already degenerated, in which the proletariat no longer holds power anymore. Power has passed into the hands of a hybrid and shapeless coalition of internal interests of the lower and upper middle classes, semi independent businessmen, and the international capitalist classes. Such a combination is contradicted only in appearance by the existence of a police-controlled and commercial Iron Curtain. Conclusion. Repudiation of any support for Russian imperial militarism, open defeatism towards Americas. As a consequence, a war which appears outwardly to wrest cooperation between privileged stratas of various countries in administering the world, as all wars do, will not be a revolutionary war in the Leninist sense. That is, a war for the protection and diffusion of proletarian power throughout the world. Such a historical eventuality, which is not today on the agenda, would never involve making justifications for any country's political and military complex. Above all, because revolutionary states, if any, could find no allies in the capitalist camp, as is clearly the case at the end of World War I. Taking our hypothetical eventuality, a strong international Communist Party would time the attacks of its sections against bourgeois powers so as to halt military quote-unquote punitive expeditions against the revolutionary countries, and would get the workers who had been armed and mobilized for such aims to turn their arms against those who armed them. There is all the more reason for any revolutionary movement to constantly maintain a comprehensively anti-capitalist and anti-state orientation in all cases where the offensive is less developed and the struggle of lesser potential. Communists note that there is only one way to stop the capitalists indulging in punitive expeditions against the proletariat. They must eliminate the capitalist class, and this cannot be done unless the vanguard of the working class is everywhere kept on a war footing. Even a temporary disarming of the class consciousness, be it ideological, organizational, or material, is therefore a betrayal wherever and whenever it occurs. The center of the communist movement must never succumb to it, even if it is a firmly established discipline, that the center is responsible for choosing the timing and forms that party action takes. Any party or group which accepts being disarmed in such a way, especially if they refer to themselves as workers, communists, or socialists, the first enemy to fight and subdue. For it's precisely their existence and the function they perform as holding back the overthrow of the capitalist system, an overthrow overseen by Marx and Engels and awaited with conviction by all revolutionary Marxists. This completely opposite strategy, which is applied during the last war by the residue of the Communist International, which led to its shameful self-liquidation, was undertaken so that, quote, the Western governments should not be hindered in their war efforts, end quote, but merely had the effect of strengthening the Western imperialist power. I agree with that. That's correct. So the thing is, the Russia could have said, no, we will not take any limitations here. We're not going to get into a fight with you, but we're not going to accept your propaganda in our borders. We're not going to stop our international organizations and so on and so forth. It's just not going to happen. These are part of our state's existence. However, at the same time, as stated, Lebensraum, Germany had specific plans to settle and colonize and turn Russia and all the Serbian areas and whatnot into living space, to do the same thing that Europeans did in America, right? Wipe out the people there and take their land and colonize, right? It is a war of aggressor against a defender. There is no, it's so complicated, No, the Nazis are the fucking aggressors. Yeah, there's an unambiguous bad guy, and whatever we can say about the Soviet treatment of the various places it liberated, and yes, it fucking liberated these places from the Nazis who had colonized them and taken over their government and established colonial government over them. Yeah, and the Soviets in the aftermath literally established liberal bourgeois governments, right? It's just yeah, it's silly, but they did. In every place that wasn't socialists beforehand, or at least like, for example, Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine was a Soviet state before it got conquered. And it's like, okay, from the perspective of the bourgeois states, the Soviet Union did everything right, and from the perspective of the communists, they kind of did things wrong, but at the same time, guess what happened with all those states besides Finland? The one state that they did not, that they did this with, that did not join the Soviet Union. They joined the Soviet Union. They elected in workers' governments when the Soviet Union said, no, you can't repress your workers, your Communist Party. And also, we're going to support the Communist Party in the elections. They all, aside from Finland, elected Communist parties to their position. So it fucking worked. And it followed the rules set out by the bourgeois international order, right? Yeah, it was all according to the UN Charter. Yeah, and then guess what? Because it was so successful in places like Vietnam and the DPRK and so many other places, they did that too. And because it was so successful, what did America and the UN do in turn? They tried to stop it. They invaded the DPRK, they invaded Vietnam because they said they saw that method of democratic elections didn't work for the capitalists. It worked for the Soviet Union, but didn't work for them. So they invaded. So essentially, the Russian methodology worked. It completely worked. Anyway, too late did the Russian government and military circles admit that the latter were more a threat to their objectives than Germany, objectives by then overtly national. Nevertheless, the new recourse to hurling accusations of barbarism and fascism is no less false and sinister. Charges are turned with equal effrontery by the quote free world, and revolutionary workers of the vanguard must aim to draw their forces together for combat in which they can expect neither help nor ammunition from the opposing military forces of today. They must work in the hope and certainty that the crisis and downfall of capitalism, expected in vain for 150 years, will strike at the heart of the highly industrialized states, and hitherto unvanquished blackguard of the world. Let's see. Let's take this. And yes, Layer Kilroy, thanks for joining. Let's see. Yes, a fun read indeed. I'll come back and summarize this later. But that's the end of the text. Appeal for the movement's international reorganization.